Walk, 2 Lewis machine guns.
Did you see any coming in or not? Was there any on the other side?
10,000 rounds of ammunition.
I saw one, I think, in this paddock down towards the front.
And 3 army personnel.
You either love them or you loathe them. And most of the time, once you start working with them, you learn to love these birds. They get under your skin. They just eat, sleep, and dream emu. And I've been doing it now for 17 years. And
the Emu Wars of 1932.
The one in Western Australia is basically they send out the army to eradicate emu from that growing area.
From the Army's perspective, they thought it might not work, but they thought this would be good practice for the Army specialists with the Lewis guns and see how they fared against moving targets.
A bit of context about why the army was dispatched to fight emus. The farmers who were asking for help were ex-World War I veterans, and they'd been given these farms as part of a soldier-settler program.
It was an idea to reward the soldiers for their sterling service overseas, to give them a farm of their own. But they never took into account that many of these guys were invalids, many of them were shell-shocked, they were traumatised in many ways, and a lot of them didn't have any farming experience. It was just a dream, like a lot of Australian guys have to own a pub one day. These guys wanted their own farm, but they had no practical experience in it.
Because so many of these ex-soldiers didn't have any farming experience, the government would advise them about what kind of crops they should grow. And in the 20s and 30s, this was wheat.
Through most of the 1920s, prices for wheat were extremely high. People compared it to wheat as being worth its weight in gold. These guys, through the 1920s, they were getting, say, 7 or 8 shillings per bushel for their wheat. By 1929, the price fell down below 5 shillings, and it kept falling in the early 1930s as the Depression got worse. Wheat was just a hopeless case. We were too dependent on it at that time, and the market just fell out of them.
And then for soldier settlers in Western Australia, to make things worse, the emus began to descend.
Now, the emus come from right in the interior of Western Australia. That's where they've built up their numbers.
Emu is very nomadic, but it's very set in its way. It will do the one track year after year because it knows that come September, when the breeding season is over, that the salt bush will throw its seed along this track. There's other fruits that starts to grow on another track, so they keep following that track year after year. They do their complete food trail.
Every year in the winter, they move eastwards. And these soldier settlements, where they'd grown all this extra wheat, was right in the path of these emus' migratory route. And, of course, they came in 1932 in huge numbers. The estimates are around about 20,000 birds. And they realised that there was manna from heaven. You know, there was all this wheat here for us to eat. This would be great. So in they came.
In the Merredin district, which is about 150 kilometres from Perth, the soldier settlers were completely inundated by these emus.
It was a hopeless plight. They just couldn't do anything about it. So they went to their local member and they asked if the army could become involved. All these guys, of course, were First World War veterans, so they knew about warfare and things like that. And they asked if the Commonwealth government could provide machine guns to use against these birds. Senator George Pearce was the Minister of Defence at that time, and he was a Western Australian. He sympathised with these guys, and he agreed to supply 2 Lewis machine guns, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, and 3 army personnel.
And they were dispatched on the Kalgoorlie Express, straight to the front line, where they were met by the farmers. Now, this is an absurd sight, if you think about it.
Initially, they thought it was going to be easy. They'd just set up the machine guns, and there'd be so many of them, they'd just walk straight into their line of fire, and that was the end of it. Day one, they go out and they set up their 2 Lewis machine guns, and they wait for the emus to come. There was a large number of emus coming towards them. O'Halloran, the gunner in particular, he had them lined up, and when they came within range, was point-blank range. He opened up, and he probably killed a dozen birds, and then you wouldn't believe it, the gun jammed. The emus had taken off. They dispersed by this time, so that was the end of it. And it was a stinking hot day, and they waited all day, and they realised the emus aren't coming back.
The farmers and army retired for the night, and over the next couple of days, they began to plot the downfall of their enemy.
They'd sit around at night by the blazing fire and discuss tactics for the following day, you know, where we're going to ambush these birds tomorrow. So they'd pick a water hole, and they'd go out there early in the morning and set up the Lewis gun. The soldier settlers would be there with their own rifles and wait for the birds to appear just on daybreak when they come in for water. And in many cases, they'd pick the wrong water hole, and no birds turned up at all. So they'd be waiting there all day for no reason.
Soon, the war began to turn in the emu's favour.
The birds seemed to work out the range of the guns. They were saying, you know, we're waiting for them, and they just won't come in range. They realised that the emus didn't come too far from the timber line. Once they got on the timber, well, you couldn't get them at all. So they obviously showed a fair bit of intelligence. They knew the effective range of the guns, and they knew to stay close to the timber where they'd be adequately protected. They basically outsmarted the army.
Yeah, to get the troops on, you've got to go bush, and you've got to spend a week in the bush to try and...
They've also been known for not being the smartest animals. What do you reckon about that?
They may not be the smartest animal, but they're not the dumbest either. They know exactly where there's food to be got. So you've got to be pretty smart to do that. They might have a small brain, but the survival brain. You grab them and they'll kick the living daylights out of you. The only way you can actually get them is to use a weapon of some sort to drop them.
Not to be outdone, the army began devising new tactics.
Well, they realised that the emus could run. that was the thing. They were too fast. I mean, an emu does 45 miles an hour or something like that. And they decided to chase after the emus. So they thought, we'll put this Lewis gun on the back of the truck and actually bolt it to the back of the truck. Now, the emus were about 60 metres in front. Here's this truck going over the ploughed ground with this gunner O'Hallahan on the back, hanging on for dear life. The emus kept their lead. They got into the timber and then they scattered. They couldn't even fire the gun because he was too busy trying to hang on for dear life. So they didn't repeat that experiment again either.
Initially, a movie-tone cameraman had been dispatched with the army to make a propaganda film for the government. But by now, word of the fiasco had spread and the press started to poke fun at the operation.
The press referred to the army personnel as Major Meredith and his merry men.
And then it got raised in Parliament.
It was extremely embarrassing, and when it started to become discussed in Parliament in Canberra, that very same day, the troops received a telegram telling them to withdraw. The whole operation had been cancelled. So that was within 12 hours of being embarrassed in Parliament by this episode.
So they try to eradicate emu, not realising the terrific properties that these emus actually contain, you know, like the goodness that they can give you if you only just used it. More incubators is where we hatch the chicks. That's an emu egg. Emu always, for the last 40,000 years, have been used by Indigenous people as part of their medicine cabinet. They also knew, since time began, that the emu fat was very good for you. Its use was a wound healer, a pain reliever, anything that needed fixing. If there was an emu nearby, its product was used to fix the problem.
The only thing learnt by the military was that machine guns certainly weren't effective weapons against emus, because the emus could absorb a lot of bullets. One was found, and it was found to have 5 bullets in it. Apparently, they thought it was from day one. So they carried these bullets around without being mortally wounded for 5 days. And it wasn't until it was killed by a truck that they found that it had been shot.
The Emu War did have one final chapter, another failed campaign about a month later.
The emus were too bright, and there was too many of them. So that was a non-event as far as that went. Major Meredith, that was in charge of this thing, he actually had a lot of praise for the emus themselves. He compared them to Zulus, and he said if we had a couple of companies of emus on our side, we could win any war.
Really like that. Can I get some sound out of that emu? As if I can snap my fingers and say, talk. Why do you think I talk so much?
There you go. It's all true too. Warbles on a lot to
You've been
YouTube.
listening to Long
Ciao.
Story Short with Mike and Jesse, and we really hope you've enjoyed tonight's recollection of some of our favourite stories and the whole Long Story Short series.
ABC
Once again, a
Radio
special
National.
thanks to Lorena Allen, who was the series producer this past 12 weeks, and for sound production on today's episode by Simon Branthwaite. Long Story Short is produced by Winding Track and Creative Nonfiction in association with RN. Please do say hello to either Mike or myself on Twitter. I'm at Mr. Jesse Cox.
I'm at Mike Williams 3.
And you can listen to any of our previous episodes by subscribing to the podcast through iTunes, or you can just head to the Long Story Short page by the RN website.
I'm Mike Williams.
And I'm Jesse Cox.
We'll see you later.
Ciao. And now Warbles on a lot listens to the news.